Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents the Zapple Diaries, The Rise and Fall of the Last Beatles Label, by Barry Miles, narrated by Shaun Grindell. Prequel. From Apple to Zapple. Apple was created in 1967 to bring the Beatles' enterprises together for tax purposes, so that instead of paying 19 and sixpence in the pound, the Beatles only paid 16 shillings. There were 20 shillings in the pound. The original directors were Clive Epstein, Alastair Taylor, Geoffrey Ellis, a solicitor and an accountant. And the idea was that they would quietly announce to the tax authorities that they would be opening a string of shops. Alastair Taylor told American author Jeffrey Giuliano. That was the original idea. And when the boys heard about this, they decided this could be boring. They didn't really want their name above a string of shops. The original idea was greetings cards. Imagine Beatles greetings cards shops. They didn't like that at all. Gradually they started drifting in on meetings, and Apple Call really evolved from there. Later it turned into this silly philosophy. John Lennon was suitably scathing. Clive Epstein or some other such business freak came up to us and said, "You've got to spend so much money, or the tax will take you." We were thinking of opening a chain of retail clothes shops or some balmy thing like that. And we were all thinking that if we are going to open a shop, let's open something we're interested in. And we went through all these different ideas about this, that, and the other. Paul had a nice idea about opening up white houses, where we would sell white china and things like that. Everything white, because you can never get anything white, you know? Which was pretty groovy. And it didn't end up with that. It ended up with Apple and all this junk and the Fool and all those stupid clothes and all that. Clive Epstein, Brian's brother, worked in the financial administration side of the New End Music Stores, NEMS, Epstein's management company, and set to work. On the 19th of April, 1967, the Beatles became a legal partnership sharing all their income, whether from group, live, or solo work, except songwriting. And the Beatles & Co. Limited was created to bind them together legally for 10 years on a goodwill share issue of £1 million. The first anyone in the public would have known of it was on the 19th of May, 1967, with the launch of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which had a discreet green apple on the back sleeve. On the 17th of November, the Beatles Limited changed its name to Apple Music Limited, and Apple Music Limited became the Beatles Limited. With Apple Music up and running, they began signing up artists. Grapefruit was the first, and John and Paul attended their first recording session, held at IBC Studios on Portland Place on the 24th of November, 1967. The band wasn't actually signed until the 11th of December. John named them Grapefruit after the book of the same name, given to him by Yoko 2 months earlier. Most of the group were former members of Tony Rivers and the Castaways, one of Brian Epstein's groups. Rather than the proposed chain of card shops, the Beatles instead opted to open a clothes boutique to be run by the Fool, 3 Dutch designers and an English publicist, who were anything but fools. Paul was having a fling with one of them. The shop opened on the 7th of December, 1967, and closed 7 months later on the 31st of July, the Beatles having decided that they did not want to be involved with the rag trade. The Beatles and their staff and friends helped themselves to the clothes. Then the public were let in to take anything they wanted for free, 1 item each. Apple's first office was above the boutique. Then shortly afterwards, they moved to more permanent, although still temporary, offices at 95 Wigmore Street on the 22nd of January. The choice of Marylebone as a location was Paul McCartney's. He knew the area well from living for several years in Wimpole Street, in the house of his then-girlfriend Jane Asher. Apple's appointed A&R man, Peter Asher, also lived there in Weymouth Street, so it was convenient for both of them. On the 12th of January, 1968, Apple Music Limited, which had been in business since June 1963 as the Beatles Limited, changed its name yet again, this time to Apple Corps Limited, and the Beatles Film Productions Limited changed its name to Apple Films Limited. Apple Corps, in turn, controlled dozens of new companies: Apple Records Limited, Apple Films Limited, Apple Music Publishing Limited, and Apple Electronics Limited, soon to be joined by Apple Wholesale Limited, Apple Retail Limited, Apple Television Limited, Apple Publicity Limited, and more. The Apple School never got off the ground. It would have been run by Ivan Vaughan, an old friend who first introduced John and Paul to each other. Neil Espinel spent weeks incorporating these companies and registering them as trademarks in every country in the world where it was possible to do so. This paid off in spades when Apple Computers launched the iPad and moved into music distribution. A series of lawsuits netted the Beatles many millions for copyright infringement. A record company needs a logo, and so Neil Espinel, now managing director of Apple Corps Limited, contacted Gene Mann, a graphic designer from Dublin who had worked on the Sgt. Pepper cover, laying out the back sleeve which contains the lyrics. The first time anyone had ever printed the lyrics on an album sleeve. Usually you had to buy them from a sheet music publisher. It also showed Paul McCartney with his back to the viewer. Neil told Gene that he needed a photograph of an apple to use on the center label of Apple Records. Gene immediately had the brilliant idea of using a photograph of an apple on the A side of the record, with no writing or information, and on the B side using a photograph of an apple sliced in half, to give a white background to all the relevant label copy for both sides. The left-hand side of the apple would be headed "This Side," with the title of the track, the artist, the running time, the publishing and copyright information. The right-hand side would be headed "Other Side," and would give the same information for the A side. Gene commissioned Paul Castell to photograph a series of apples, red apples, green apples, and sliced apples against different colored backgrounds. 2 days later, they had an assortment of 2¼ inch transparencies of apples against red, blue, black, green, and yellow backdrops. Gene selected the 2 he thought were the best, but included the others for consideration. It turned out that it was a legal requirement for copyright to list the contents on both sides of the record, so that idea was out. Meetings were held, and slides of various apples were projected onto office walls. Batches of 8-inch by 10-inch color prints were made, 6 at a time, 1 for each Beatle, and 1 each for Neil Espinel and Ron Cass, the head of Apple Records. Eventually, they decided upon a nice shiny green Granny Smith on a black background. Alan Aldrich, former chief designer for Penguin Books, who was to publish the Beatles' illustrated lyrics, was brought in to draw the copyright lettering that surrounds the outer perimeter of each record. The finished artwork was sent to New York, where the dye transfers were made from which all the labels would be printed. It had taken 6 months. Apple would become a fully functioning company. I was not involved in the early days. I joined towards the end of 1968. But the staff stayed more or less the same until Alan Klein came in and fired everyone. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were the presidents of the company. Neil Espinel, their former roadie, became managing director. He had previously trained as an accountant. Alastair Taylor from NEMS was the general manager, and Mr. Fixit, Peter Brown, who had been with Brian Epstein since the early days, was made a director and was the master Mr. Fixit and the Beatles' personal assistant. Peter Brown's own personal assistant was Joanne Newfield, who had previously been Brian Epstein's personal assistant until he died. Harry Pinsker, the head of Bryce Hanmer Accountants, became a director. Peter Asher was appointed head of A&R, with Chris O'Dell as his personal assistant. Malcolm Evans, the Beatles' roadie, was made assistant managing director. Derek Taylor was made director of public relations and had a staff of 7, not all of them paid. Alexis Mara, Magic Alex, the former television repairman, became head of Apple Electronics. Dennis O'Dell was head of Apple Films. Ron Cass left his job as president of Liberty Records to become head of Apple Records, one of the most important figures in the place. There were maybe 20 other directors and staff running the various Apple divisions. Accountant Harry Pinsker and 4 of the other directors resigned in protest against John and Yoko appearing nude on the sleeve of 2 virgins. Not from prudery, there's not much of that in the record business, but because they saw it as damaging to the Beatles' image. The way the companies were set up meant that all the directors resigned each year and were reappointed. When Klein moved in, he made sure that Peter Brown and Neil Espinel were not reappointed. Klein could not believe that they were not all motivated by greed and the desire to be the most powerful man in the company, but they weren't. Most of them were motivated by misplaced loyalty to the Beatles. They would do anything for them, working incredibly long hours to achieve the impossible and receiving scant praise for doing so. As can be determined, Apple was a typical 60s company. All the bosses, without exception, were men, and all the secretaries were women. and without the women, very little would have ever been done there. The Beatles had encountered strong opposition to the sleeve of Sgt. Pepper from EMI on the grounds of cost, and felt that EMI were out of touch with them and with the youth record market. Apple was seen as a way of controlling their own brand, as it would now be called. All along, they had wanted to release more controversial and experimental material, John and Yoko's Two Virgins being the best example, which EMI had refused point-blank to distribute, and the Zapple division was created specifically to do this. Chapter 1. Z is for Zapple. Early in spring 1968, Apple Records placed advertisements in the music press written by Derek Taylor that read, "A is for Apple, Z is for Zapple. Introducing Zapple, a new label from Apple Records." For about a year now, Apple has been producing pop records, and it's done quite well too, with artists like Mary Hopkins, Jackie Lomax, and, of course, the Beatles. Many people have asked, why don't we try something different for a change? Enough pop is enough, they've said. Well, we don't want Apple to become a one-product company, any more than anyone else does, so we've done something about it. This something is called Zapple. What's Zapple about? We want to publish all sorts of sounds. Some of these sounds will be spoken, some electronic, some classical. We'll be producing recorded interviews too. Some of the people we put on record will be well known, some not so well known. This means that you'll get plenty of variety. We don't want Zapple to become a one-track record label. We'll publish almost anything, provided it's valid and good. We're not going to put out rubbish at any price. What will Zapple cost? We decided to divide the Zapple label into 3 price categories. These prices will depend by and large on the contents and production costs of the album. If the album doesn't cost much to produce, then you won't pay much. The 3 price categories are as follows: 15 shillings, Zap; 21 shillings, Zap Rec; 37.5, Zapple. The first 2 Zapples will be out May the 26th. One by John Lennon and Yoko Ono is called Life with the Lions, Unfinished Music No. 2. The others by George Harrison is called Electronic Sound. This is a new thing for George. It's all done on a machine called the Moog synthesizer. One side's called Under the Mersey Wall, the other's called No Time or Space. The third Zapple album will be by American poet Richard Brautigan. It'll be called Listening to Richard Brautigan. We're hoping to release it soon along with the other one, which we've yet to decide on. Where to buy Zapples? Zapple should be on sale in most leading record shops and some bookshops. If you're not sure what a leading record shop is and whether there's one near you, fill in the coupon below and pop it in the post to us. Not only will we tell you where to get hold of a Zapple, but we'll keep you informed about future Zapples. Our future Zapples will include records by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Michael McClure, Charles Olson, Allen Ginsberg, and American comedian Lord Buckley. So listen to Zapple, it's something else again. The advertisement ended with a coupon giving Jack Oliver's name and the address of Apple at 3 Savile Row. In the USA, Jack's address was given as 1750 North Vine, Hollywood, California, 90028, the address of the Capitol Tower, the U.S. subsidiary of EMI Records, distributors of Apple and Zapple Records. Zapple's roots went back even earlier than those of its parent company, Apple. It came from a Paul McCartney project back in the winter of 1965-6. I knew Paul from the Indica Books and Gallery project. I had been the manager of Better Books on Charing Cross Road, an avant-garde bookshop that specialized in French film, modern poetry, experimental art and theatre. There were film shows and poetry readings, including one by Allen Ginsberg and another by Lawrence Ferlinghetti that I organized. The owner, Tony Godwin, had decided to sell it and move to New York, and it looked as if the avant-garde and experimental sides of the shop would cease to be. I decided to start my own bookshop and almost immediately connected with artist and critic John Dunbar, who was looking to start his own art gallery. It seemed obvious that we should combine forces. And John brought in an old friend of his, Peter Asher, who provided the initial money for the venture. Peter was one half of Peter and Gordon, a successful duo who had recently had a #1 hit in both the USA and the UK. Together we formed a company called Miles, Asher and Dunbar Limited, MAD, and began to look for premises that would be suitable for both an art gallery and a bookshop. Indica Books and Gallery, yes, it was named after cannabis indica, was started on August 1965 on £2,000, of which Peter Asher put in £1,400 and I put in £600 worth of books. I had an arrangement with Tony Godwin to buy stock from him at a trade discount and to be able to order books from publishers using his account. He had sold better books and approved very much of the idea of indica and wanted to help as much as he could. In the meantime, I began to assemble the stock for the bookshop in the basement music room of Peter's parents' house at 57 Wimpole Street. Peter still lived at home then, as did his sister, the actress Jane Asher. Peter had an L-shaped room on the top floor, and in the smaller room next door, once a maid's room, directly above Jane's bedroom, lived Jane's boyfriend, Paul McCartney. He had been there for several years, ever since the Beatles moved to London from Liverpool in 1963. Paul took an immediate interest in the book stock, and sometimes, late at night, when he got in from a club or a gig, he would browse through the books and leave me a note to say which ones he had taken. He was Indica's first customer. John Dunbar found premises next to the Scotch and St. James's, a club in Mason's Yard, off Duke Street, St. James's. This was the appropriate area for the gallery, because it was where the few modern art galleries that London had were located, 1 or 2 streets either side of Piccadilly. Paul McCartney yet again took an active role, preparing the walls, filling in holes with polymer filling, painting walls and helping put up the shelves. We had to whitewash the windows to stop crowds gathering to watch. Peter reported that Paul had been behaving in a suspicious way and would not let anyone into his room. We joked that he must have a groupie holed up in there. Then, on the day the bookshop opened, Paul pulled up in his Aston Martin and heaved a large, heavy package out from the back seat. He had designed and had printed wrapping paper for the shop, 5,000 sheets of it. He had hand-lettered the name and address of the shop in black and white and composed them in the shape of a Union Jack, very 60s. It was a terrific gift, and he was correct in thinking that we had not thought to provide ourselves with wrapping paper, so it was very welcome. In addition to the books I assembled in the music room, I also lent Paul magazines and books, Big Table magazines from Chicago, Evergreen Review from New York, New Departures from London, Paris Review, and the like, all featuring Beat Generation or avant-garde work by Samuel Beckett, John Cage, Jack Kerouac, Cornelius Cardew, William Burroughs, Jean Genet and their circle. He enjoyed At Swim, Two Birds by Flann O'Brien and Ubuwa by Alfred Jarry. In those days, it was Paul who was the avant-garde one. While John Lennon stayed at home in the stockbroker belt, Paul and Jane Asher attended premieres and first nights. Jane had been a child actress and knew a large number of film and theatre people. Through Indica Gallery, Paul met artists such as Takis and bought one of his signals, a red and blue light mounted on thin metal wands, person height. Inspired by Paul, John and George also bought one. Unimpressed, Ringo had his chauffeur knock one up in the workshop of his garage. Paul called them Peter and Gordon because the red light was the shorter of the two. Peter had red hair, typical Beatle irreverent humour. Gallery owner Robert Fraser introduced him to a number of his artists, including Peter Blake and Eduardo Paolozzi, and he bought examples of their work. He attended private views of Claes Oldenbury and Richard Hamilton, and on one occasion Fraser took Andy Warhol round to Paul's house, and they screened Chelsea Girls for him and a bunch of friends using 2 projectors. Paul was impressed that Warhol didn't seem to be particularly bothered about getting the 2 projectors in sync. At my flat, Paul listened to Blue Beat records, Shenley Duffers, Duck Soup by John Bago, The Charms, Derek and Patsy, Prince Buster and the All-Stars, as well as John Cage's Indeterminacy, a set of texts, some longer than others, but all read aloud by Cage in 2 minutes. For some he had to read very quickly, others very slowly. One crowd-pleaser, after a few joints, was a 2-volume Folkways recording of a ceremony held in a Japanese Zen monastery. One track consisted of a bell that rang once a minute. The build-up of tension waiting for the bell to ring was palpable, and the relief immediate and hilarious. I had a lot of records by Albert Ayler on ESP, and Danish Debut, Pharaoh Saunders, the 2 ESP recordings by Sun Ra and his solo orchestra, Ron Blake and the controversial, at the time, free jazz album by the Ornette Coleman Double Quartet. 38 minutes of spontaneous collective inspiration by 2 reeds, 2 bassists, 2 drummers, and 2 trumpets. It was this album that inspired Paul to suggest that if you were in complete control of your consciousness, you would be able to differentiate between audio sounds so completely that you could release a record with Beethoven on the left stereo and the Beatles on the right, playing simultaneously. He said, "I remember one of our ideas was to master 2 records onto a thing, and all you would do in the future was you'd just switch out one of them with your brain. You'd say, 'I'm not listening to the Beethoven, I'm listening to the Beatles.' But they would be both going on. So this was cheap, cheerful, good value for money. You had to be able to switch one of them out." He was sure the brain was capable of deciding which one to listen to, and had the ability to flip between one and the other. In other words, a typical 60s stoned conversation. Other favorites included the IBM 7090 computer singing Bicycle Made for Two, and Luciano Berio's electronic music compositions based on speeded-up and collaged tape recordings. In Paul's own words, he was walking around town with his antenna out, absorbing information and ideas, filing them away for future use. Of course, he was also imparting information. I learned far more about music listening to him talk and explain than he did from browsing his way through my record collection. Paul's reaction to the experimental literary magazines I lent him was to envisage an audio equivalent. One September evening in 1965, Peter Asher and Paul were visiting me and my wife Sue at our flat in Hanson Street. We were talking about how difficult it was for people to find out what was happening at the experimental end of the arts, when Paul suggested an audio magazine that would come out monthly or even fortnightly, and instead of a review of a poetry reading or a book, there would be a recording of the reading or the author reading from the book. The idea would be for an editor to gather in recordings of all that month's most interesting cultural activity, be it a scientific lecture or an obscure performance at the Wigmore Hall. Paul said, instead of reading in Melody Maker that there was a great jam session down the Bag O' Nails and that Eric Burdon and Georgie Fame were playing together, there would be a recording of it. We could even have really important things from the BBC Third programme that people might have missed, have it available on subscription as cheap as it could possibly be. We should be able to put it out really cheap, what with the vast resources of EMI and NEMS. It was all very exciting. The problem was that none of us had time to actually do it. Between Peter and myself, we could have edited it without too much trouble. But as to actually making all the recordings and getting copyright clearances from people's managements and from copyright holders, that was a full-time job. However, Paul felt sure that NEMS could handle the paperwork. It was just a question of the recordings. Our stone discussions, which were sometimes held at John Dunbar's and Marianne Faithfull's flat at 29 Lennox Gardens in Knightsbridge, had led us into a fantasy world of a radio station, a television station, and a newspaper. However, in the reality of daytime practicality, we scaled down our ambitions a bit and decided that we could record the initial issues of the audio magazine ourselves, and that later we could branch out into live recordings and extracts from BBC plays and so on, which would all involve complex negotiations. It would have made most sense to make an arrangement with Northern Songs, Lennon and McCartney's music publishers, to use their demo studios for the project, but we didn't think of that. Or if we did, the idea was probably rejected because we would largely be working in the evenings and nighttime, whereas Denmark Street would be strictly daytime. I mentioned that my friend, Ian Somerville, might be able to do the job of running a recording studio, as he was the person who recorded the 3 spoken word albums that I had produced earlier that summer. Allen Ginsberg reading at Better Books, Lawrence Ferlinghetti reading at Better Books, and Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Gregory Corso, and Andrei Voznesensky reading at the Architectural Association. Earlier in the year, Ian had recorded and produced William Burroughs' first album, Call Me Burroughs, in the cave beneath the English bookshop in Paris, and had been the technical brains behind the cut-up tapes that William Burroughs and Brian Geisen had been producing ever since 1960. Ian was gaunt with sandy brown hair that stood on end as he constantly ran his fingers through it in a nervous gesture. He had a degree in mathematics from Cambridge and was living in a hotel in Earl's Court with William Burroughs, who had just returned to London after 9 months in New York. Ian was also the man we employed to install the electrical wiring for the bookshop gallery, so he had already met John Dunbar and Peter Asher. A meeting was arranged at my flat to try to get the project started. I used the living room as a painting studio, and the only lighting was a daylight fluorescent fitting that was uncomfortably bright for a meeting. However, Peter, Paul, Jane, Sue and I made ourselves comfortable as best we could, and everyone but Jane got high, while Ian, for some reason, explained the principle of floating equations. Peter seemed interested, but it passed over the heads of the rest of us. Eventually, we got him to calculate how much it would cost to equip a basic studio. Ian, still looking rather nervous, made a list. 2 Revox 736 tape recorders, a pair of microphones with stands, amplifiers, speakers, a stock of tape, spare tape reels, a degauser, editing block, blades, a cassette machine to make copies, a record player, and various cables and bits and pieces. He wrote it all out in his beautiful copperplate writing, along with an approximate costing of each and a total. He was expecting to discuss and justify each item. The Revoxes were about £150 each, but Paul gave the list a quick glance and returned it to Ian, saying he should call Brian Epstein at a certain number, and the payment would be taken care of. Done. Just like that. We still didn't know where this studio was to be located, but a day or two later Paul called in a great excitement. Brian Epstein had bought an office building just 1 block from the Indica Gallery off Duke Street, St. James's, and Paul had arranged with Brian that he, Peter, John Dunbar, Ian Somerville and I were to have the top floor. The building came equipped with a fast modern lift, still a rarity in Britain. There was a reception room already furnished with a television and a carpet and an office where we could handle the paperwork, with a room leading off it that could house the studio. Paul was discussing plans for the studio with Epstein, as this was likely to be something rather more permanent than we had envisaged, and would be used for auditions and as a demo studio for Brian's groups. It would need to be soundproofed and have mixing facilities, a lathe to make acetates and so on. Ian had estimated that it would cost about £9,000 to install all this. Delighted by this turn of events, we calculated that the first issue of the magazine album could be out in 8 weeks. It was to have a long electronic piece by Paul that he had already recorded on his pair of Brunel tape recorders, a mutter poem by Pete Brown, who had performed a similar work by Kurt Schwitters that summer at the Great Albert Hall poetry reading, and who was now helping us construct and decorate Indica. There was to be a story by Adrian Mitchell, and Burroughs had promised to cut up tape. We got as far as making a list of people who would receive free copies: Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, Warhol, the Fugs, East Village Other, and the other underground newspapers, before a problem over the office building occurred, which meant that we had to put the project on hold. Paul's solution was to install a temporary studio in an old flat that Ringo owned, but no longer used because too many fans knew the address, while the new building was being fitted out. Paul rented it from him. It was in the ground floor and basement of 34 Montague Square, not far from the Asher's house on Wimpole Street where Peter and Paul lived, and easy walking distance from my flat. On a practical level, the studio was ideal for Ian because he was in a difficult position with his love life. He had been William Burroughs' boyfriend since the end of 1959, but at the end of 1964, when they were living in Tangier, Burroughs took off for New York, giving no indication when he was likely to return. He made various attempts to get Ian to join him, but without success. After a few months, Ian found a new boyfriend, Alan Watson, whom he met in his hometown of Darlington, while up there on a visit. Then Burroughs decided that he didn't like New York and returned to London, where he moved into the Rushmore Hotel in Earl's Court. Undecided what to do, Ian moved in with him. Then he moved Alan into a separate room in the Rushmore. Ian had no money, and Burroughs was paying for all of them. Not surprisingly, there was a degree of tension. The situation was becoming farcical when the offer of Ringo's flat came up. It made sense for Ian actually to live there because it was in the evenings that people wanted to use the studio, and this would mean he was always there. He and Alan moved in. It seemed a good way to compensate Ian for his time spent as a recording engineer. He could also make tape copies or record demos as a way of supplementing his income. Ian bought the equipment, all to studio quality and at a small discount from Teletape on Shaftesbury Avenue. Now the studio existed, the problem arose of who was going to use it and who would produce the audio magazine. In theory, I would have been the best placed to edit the magazine because of my contacts in the literary world.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?